Hey, what's up guys? It's Pedro here from newcoder.com, and in this tutorial we are going to be talking about form validation with class-based components. Alright, so to get started, first I want to just go over what we have now. So first, all we have is a form. We have an onSubmit function, so all we're doing for now is just preventing the default. We have two input fields, so we have a username and password. We also have a login button. And last but not least, we just have a handler that just listens for changes within the input. So we have this up here. Okay, so what I want to do is add validation to this form. So right here, I'm going to come up here, and within our state object, let's give a property of errors. And we'll initialize this to an empty object for now. So now what we want to do is ask ourselves, where is a proper place that we could go ahead and do validation in? Well, we could do validation every time a user types within an input. So we could put our validation within the onChange handler, but the most logical place you would want to put it is probably the submit function. So the submit function gets invoked when the user hits login. And basically what you want to do is check the user's input before you actually submit that data to your server. So this sounds like a good place to do our form validation. All right, so from here, let's go within our onSubmit. And what we're going to do is let us declare a variable. So we'll say const is valid. And is valid is going to be the resulting value from a function that we're going to create. And I just called it form validation. All right, so from here, let's actually create this form validation function. And the first thing I'm going to do is pull the username and password from our state. Next thing we're going to do is use a flag, and you'll see what the flag is in a second, or how it's going to be used. So I just called it is valid, and we're going to initialize this flag to true. So true being that there's nothing wrong with the user's input. Next, we're going to create our error object. And we'll initialize this as an empty object for now. And now what we could do is check our inputs. So for example, we have our username input. So what I can do is let's go ahead and say username.trim. So this is just to get rid of the extra white spaces if there are any. And we could check the length of it and see if the length is greater than 6. So we'll just say if the length is less than 6, that means, hey, this guy's username is too short, for example. So if that's the case, if it's too short, that means we have an error. So what we can do is say errors dot, and you can name this property whatever you want. So I'm just going to call it username length, and we'll say username is, or we could say username must be of length 6 or higher, something like that, anything you want. After that, once we set our error message, what we need to do is update the is valid flag, because now we have an error. So we'll set that to false, meaning it's no longer a valid input. But we're not only limited to only having one error. So let's give another example. So let's say instead of username trim, we'll get rid of all this. And we could say if the username includes the $sign. Let's say a username has to have the $sign. So let's negate this. So if the user does not have a $sign within his username, that means that, hey, this username, as far as we're concerned, is invalid. So let's go ahead and delete this, and we'll call this property username $sign. And we'll just change the error. And we'll say username must have a $sign. And likewise, you could do the same exact thing for the password. So I'll just copy this, but I think you guys are starting to get the point. So if I just remove this, we'll do the same exact thing that we did for our first username check. We'll say if the password dot trim to get rid of the white space dot length is less than 8, that means that this is an invalid password. So we could get rid of this and we could say the password length, and we could edit this message. So we could say password must be of length 8 or higher. All right, so after we build out this error object, what we can do is update the state. So I could say this.setState, and we'll just pass in that error object. Next, what we can do is return the flag that we set. All right, so far so good, right? So we have this function that we created is going to validate whether or not this form is good or not. So now let us display whatever our errors object came up with. So what we can do is pull out from the state errors, since we set state within the form validation function. So this should contain all the errors that we have. Now what I can do is let us come down here and let's actually make this underneath the submit button. You could put this wherever you want. We're just outputting the error. So what we can do is use some JavaScript. So we have the curly braces. We're going to call the object. And within this object, we have a function called keys. And what keys is going to do is accept an argument of an object that you could pass in, obviously. And this object we're going to pass in is errors. So let's go ahead and pass that in. And what we're going to get back is an array of the name properties within this object. So what we can do is take advantage of that since it's an array. And if you work with React at all, you know that we always use the map function. And what we are going to do is pass back a function here, and we're going to get back the key. So this key obviously is going to be used to access the value within that object. So what we need to do is return what we want to show. And what we want to show is the error. So what we could do is return a div, and we could output whatever error is within the errors object. And we can access the value through the key that we're getting back. So since we're using the map, we also have to provide a key prop. Otherwise, React is going to complain. And we're just going to set that to the key that we're getting in. And again, the key being the property name. All right, so that is pretty much all we need to display an error or all the errors within our object. So let us go ahead and save this. And let's take a look at this in the browser. So here we have our form. We type, I hit submit or I hit login. There you go. It says username must be of length 6 or higher. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That makes sense. We also need a $sign within our username. So that's popping up as well. And the password obviously has to be length 8 or higher. So our errors are popping up. If you don't like it to be displayed like this, what you can do is pass an inline style. It doesn't even have to be an inline style. I'm just doing it for convenience. And we could say that this has to appear as red. So now if I save this, take a look at this. So I type, hit submit. There you go. Username length of 6 higher. So let's try to fill some of these criteria. So let's say we're at 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 characters for the username. And if I hit login, you can see that that error is removed. Now let's go ahead and add that $sign. Hit login. That error is removed. And all we need to do is pass a password that's greater than 8. So 5, 6, 7, 8. And there you go. Now, a common thing that you might want to do is once the form is validated, what you can do is check, and if the form is validated, you would send username and password to server, and then server will do its authentication process, stuff like that, and you'll get a response and you'll do whatever you want with that. But for this tutorial, we're not hooked up to a database, so we can't do any of that. But a common thing that you might want to do is after a successful submission, you might want to reset the form. So what I can do is say this.setState, and we'll say username is going to be empty, and password is also going to be empty. So I save this, go back to our web page. I type, username must have a $sign. Let's go ahead and put that $sign. Hit login. Everything's good to go. Form resets. So that is pretty much all I wanted to cover within this tutorial, and I'll see you guys in the next one.